Well, you've got Aqua Traction on your shirt, Traction
Traction
on your
hat.
hat. Your booth is right there. Your
It
dad's
is.
manning the booth right now.
You got
Tell
it.
me about it, what you got going on with
Yeah. So now
Aqua
for our
Traction.
third season here in Rochester, Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, actually, we've got kind of a little Northeast program. We've been installing, XPE foam floors in boats for marine decking, and it's been very successful. I know Matt Yablonski's got it in his boat, and a couple other guys have been, talking about putting it in their boats. But yeah, we've had a great season so far. We've got boats in key right now. We've got a couple to do next week, and it's going to be a great 2025. So yeah, if you need any information, definitely reach out, aquatraction.com, and we are now the Northeast upstate New York dealer.
Awesome.
Yep.
Tell me about what that process looks like. If I called you and said, "Hey, I want to put it in my boat,"
Yeah,
what happens
absolutely.
next?
So we just look for a square footage. Everything is based on, how big that coverage area is going to look. So we would just need a measurement.
Mm-hmm.
We can throw together a quote, and then we go to the design. That's where I have my fun, is with my art background. I get to do a little fun work with your design and pattern and color. And with that, we take it to our engineers at Aqua Traction. They spit back a really nice, colorful proof,
Mm-hmm.
and that allows us to go through any notes or decide if we want to change things up. And another 5 to 7 days, we've got a floor in the shop. So we come to our clients. We actually go to the boat and actually will visit them and do the work right on site at their marina or at their dry dock. We can do them on the water also once the weather starts to change a little bit. It gets super busy, but
Mm-hmm.
we can definitely fit them in. And as long as we have 65 degrees on the floor, we can adhere to any of those surfaces that we've been looking for. We do a lot on vinyl. We do a lot on smooth glass. We've got a ton of non-skid glass that we try to cover, and helps guys with just back problems and bending down to take a hook out of a fish, putting your knees on something more comfortable. So
Mm-hmm.
it's been working out really well. I've had it at my Ranger now for this will be our 4th season, and I love it. I keep it just like the day that I received it and got it installed. And keeping it clean is really easier than I expected. So that's been the number one thing I see the most, is not only comfortability, but just the way that I can keep it clean. It's been awesome.
What about prep right now? I got some carpet in my boat that's
Yeah.
pretty slimy. If I wanted to put it in my boat, how would I
Yeah.
go
So
forward with
we would just, have you take that carpet out and just, reveal that material that's underneath,
it? Mm-hmm.
get you scanned out. We come with our, our plotter, and we'll plot it out and figure out what your dimensions are. And it's really not too bad as long as you have a clean and dry boat when we get there. It's easy peasy. It's kind of a 1, 2, 3, 4 process. And, a lot of the guys are really starting to customize these things to their own. So if we have a Fishhawk logo that we want to, put in on a laser, or we've got some pocket logos that we're able to put in, we can really spice them up with some rulers and some different patterns and stuff. So definitely something to look into for sure.
Very cool. How about let's talk some fishing? What do you got going on this year on the water?
Yeah, 2025 for me looks to be another busy grinder of a season, working full time and having a full time job and having some side businesses. Fishing does take a little bit of a side dish, but at the end of the day, it's my passion. It's where I want to land. I just signed up for another year on the NWT. Last year I ended up 4th in the championship out of Huron, and was really proud of that finish, and put together a top 40 throughout the year, so it was consistent again. And I think this year we're really going to try to dive in and go full steam again. We've got an April tournament out in the Dakotas. We're going to head out there for our first one, and then we're back on the Mississippi in May, which is a place we fish, just not those specific pools of places we fish. We're in 7, 8, and 9 this year, over in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and then back to another familiar place where we had our championship up in Lake Huron. We're actually out of Alpena, just a little bit further north than Escoda,
Mm-hmm.
and then back to the home waters of Dunkirk. So we've got the 4th and final qualifier for this year was going to be right here in our backyard, which sometimes is the curse, as you
Right.
know. But with kind of a rule twist this year, the year that Johnny Hoyer took it to us on the North Shore, they've actually put some boundaries in this year. And so we're going to be fishing New York State waters only. And also, too, another wrinkle is 12 fish, no call. So each co-angler and professional angler have to reel in their own 6.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you have 12 in your live well, you're done.
Okay.
So I think that's going to change, some approaches to a lot of guys, especially the guys that are traveling and haven't fished here as much, just trying to get a gauge on what the class of fish we have. But, by August, I think it's 7th and 8th this year, this school of fish that we receive from that Western Basin is pretty healthy.
Mm-hmm.
On average, it's a 5 and 6 pound fish with an occasional 7 and 8. And if you can get those 7 and 8s to bite, you're looking at a pretty good bag. So I think it's going to be one of those years where, if you can find a class of fish and stay on them and get the right bites at the right time and be selective on what you call, or excuse me, turn back because you cannot call, right?
Yep.
It's going to be, you could see some weights, possibly back in those 40s again if you do it right, for sure.
Yeah. How excited are you for that? And that, yeah, you got to go out to Dakotas. Yeah, you're going to go fish on the Mississippi River, but you have 2 events on big water, and that's kind of your bread and butter.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's going to be one of the keys to qualifying is, just surviving those first 2 and then really trying to hit home on those last 2. And, these big water situations, with the boats we now have, with the technology, with our graphs at high speed, if you can mark fish at 30, 35 miles an hour, that really shrinks that sandbox to play in, right? So, I think that's going to be a big key to it. And again, some of these fish are going to be super deep, and we know how to get to them in certain applications. So we've got the equipment. We know some of the areas, the key hideouts in some of these fish. So, hopefully we'll have some success, cash a few checks, and put the money back in the bank where it belongs.
Yeah. So a lot of these guys that you're competing against are guys who they are going to go out and maybe use their forward-facing sonar. They're going to try to drop shot these fish. They're going to go fish them in 30 feet of water, try to find those fish that they can pinpoint and pick off one fish at a time. Where you're going to go out there with your trolling program, get over the top of them, try to find the better ones, but you're basically cruising over the top of these fish. Tell me about how that strategy plays out for you compared to the way that maybe those guys that specialize on a place like, Pool 7
Right.
would that's their bread and butter, and they come out and try to fish where you fish. How does that strategy play out for you?
I think with that 2 rod per person rule really does change that application of, can I get enough bites with 1 rod in the front, 1 rod in the back, for the specific fish that we're looking for, which is that, again, moving ahead of that 5 to 7 pound range, looking for those 8-pound fish. And I think, the one thing that with a trolling program, you're covering so much more water. I mean, when these fish start to spread out and chase bait, and we've got a lot of temperature changes and a lot of thermocline changes and things that are chasing. If we can't get rods in the water and cover 1.5 miles, 2 miles in an hour, compared to maybe on a 7 or an 8 power, maybe going 1 mile, 1.5 miles, we're going to cover that much more water, than the competition. Hopefully, getting those hungry fish to bite, because as we know, not all fish are hungry, right? And so, if we can find the right schools that are feeding, the active schools that are up feeding, and present a bait to them at a speed that they're looking for, and get a presentation that they're, hungry for, I think we'll have some success there. I mean, that doesn't mean we won't look at jigging as an option, because, we did have some success. But, it's funny, some lakes just fish, some areas just fish tight with a trolling pattern. And if you have both, you're in much better shape than if you have just one.
Right.
So I think it will definitely be an advantage. There's going to be some local talent that's going to want to jump in for sure, and guys will do a little bit of potlucking and hopefully get in and cash. But it just comes back to consistency. You've got to get baits in the right place. You got to get in that strike zone. You got to be in the right speed. A lot of times, it could be something as a change of a blade size out here. It could be that color can sometimes play a role. People say, at the end of the day, does color really play a major role? And it can, especially when we got super clear water, which we do. We don't get the algae, we don't get the blooms, we don't get that mix of runoff. And fortunately for us, we've narrowed it down to some colors and some sizes and patterns. And, we'll start there and we'll see where the drawing board takes us,
Yeah. Right now, people think of Lake Erie like this is the good old days.
It is.
There's a bumper crop of fish out there for somebody who is, at least a competent angler. They can go out and get themselves a fish dinner. It can be done pretty easily. Go out and get your tacos. But when you're out there, especially when we're talking about a no-call tournament, you're looking for the upper level of fish. How do you target those so when you're out there, you're not banging 2-pounders, that you can go out there and try to find those 7, 8, 9-pound fish?
And if everybody knew the recipe to that, we'd be all, cashing big checks. And that's, that is something we have 100% struggled with here because of that influx of different year classes, and, competing with those smaller fish, competing with those fish that are, in that 20 to 24 inch range. They're plentiful and they're usually the most aggressive. And so, but every once in a while, can you get a big one out of there? Sure. So that might be a numbers game that you have to put in your head, in your pre-fish or in your practice, where you can get out there and say, okay, it's going to take us 12 good bites to find one good one. So that means we've got to get quite a few bites,
Mm-hmm.
in a day to get a keeper. So we've got to use that practice, I think, time as a, as a gauge to figuring that out. But there are some key areas. There's some times where, some of those little shallow rock piles or some of those little weed edges, or it could be a, an off the beaten path area that we can find a class of fish that is grouping together in that larger tournament size, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I think we found that 2 years ago when we won the Innovative Outdoor Challenge over here in Dunkirk, where, fortunately for us, we had found a bite that was just in a little bit different location than everybody else. We'd found some fish that were just doing a little different, not catching as many, but enough to get this thing rolling. And we had 12 bites on our first pass.
Yeah.
And with a little bit of motor trouble, we were about 12 miles offshore, came in on a kicker, and luckily
At least
for
you
us,
control your way home.
we just wanted to get home, and 8 footers. So there was very little trolling on it, but ended up winning that tournament on one pass.
Yeah.
And so the right magical pass can happen if you're around the right fish, right? So
what you're saying is it's more of a location thing than a technique thing. Is just finding those fish.
it could, in some cases it can be,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm a fan of just getting bites, watching a board go back, watching a dipsy go off, watching a rod, watching a rigger, any of those things. That's the tug is the drug, that gets us out of bed in the morning before, I find myself setting my alarm earlier for fishing than I do for work, right?
Mm-hmm.
My snooze went off 3 times this morning before I actually had to get rolling. But for fishing, it's one of those, oh, did I miss it?
Right.
So, but yeah, I mean, it can be location, but, again, going back to the technique thing, I think spreading out on these bigger pieces of water can be an advantage. Getting that spread out, having 4 rods in compared to everybody else's. I get reports all the time. Geez, we caught 32 fish today. Geez, we caught 48. Well, you had 14 rods out. Of course, you're going to catch that many, right? And so when we get into our tournament series, which is, like I said, I mentioned two per side or 2 per man, only having 4 in your spread, it also really does dictate, can you spread some things out and find that bite again day 2, day 3? And so that's something, without that larger amount of equipment in the water, you really do have to hone in sometimes on your technique. And I think it really does come down to speed a lot of times too, which we're going to talk about later on the show for sure.
Yeah. And I would say when you do that, it kind of limits your ability to experiment with things. I mean, you're going to be running your top stuff, and that's it.
And that's the one thing that I see, especially when we're fishing Western Basin Fall Brawl. We got 3 rods a guy, we got 4 guys in the boat. Let's put one at 40, let's put one at 60, let's put one at 80. Oh, they're all biting at 60. Well, if we didn't have one, in that range and not having as many in our spread, it's going to be tough to hone in on 60 if that ends up being the number. So I think that's the game, again, that you're pre-fishing and the time that you put in prior to a tournament can really, dictate where at least you get started. Because as we know, every day is different.
Yeah. Tell me about that. So you're out there and maybe you pick a fish or 2 at 60. Maybe you got a couple lines at 40, you got another line running at 30. How fast are you moving those lines down to 60?
I'm usually pretty hesitant. It's tough to really go all in on a program, that really can just say, hey, I'm all in on all at 60 and I'm all at color and I'm all doing white and I'm all doing purple, whatever it is. And I think, I like to always have kind of that oddball. It seems like that one, it doesn't catch all the fish, but usually catches a big fish. And for me, it's usually a high line. If I can run a high line, and sometimes those bigger fish are up in that surface film chasing bait, they just don't want to be bothered by the schoolies. For me to just to have something away. But those other 3, I'll dictate, through that process of working through it. And for sure, I'll 100% use those 4 as much as possible. And I've always got that one lone ranger out there, always trying to, pluck that big trophy fish or try to get that 8-pounder plus. And usually it works out by the end of the day.
Yeah.
So we'll see.